The fixed expense of capital in the short run does not become a fixed cost in the long run. That's because in the long run you can vary capital just like you can vary labor, and so in the long run both capital and labor are variable costs and therefore contribute to marginal costs. Only if an input remains fixed in the long run does its expense become a fixed cost in the long run. You might think of a manager's entrepreneurial talent as something that's fixed for a firm and that can't easily be replicated, so that even in the long run, if the firm wanted to have more of it, it couldn't get it. So there are fixed costs in the long run, not just fixed costs associated with inputs that remain fixed in the long run, but also fixed costs like license fees that have to be paid every year, or fire insurance premiums that come due monthly, or things of that sort. We'll investigate here the role of such fixed costs in the long run on long-run output supply. We begin by assuming a U-shaped long-run marginal cost curve, which implies that the underlying production technology has initially increasing returns to scale that eventually becomes decreasing returns to scale. If there were no fixed costs in the long run, then the relationship between the long-run average cost curve and the long-run marginal cost curve would be the same as the relationship between the short-run average cost curve and the short-run marginal cost curve. The two curves would start at roughly the same place, and the marginal cost curve would cross the average cost curve at the lowest point of the average cost curve from below. This curve is what we'll call the average variable cost curve in the long run, because it's the average cost curve that's associated with the costs that are variable costs, the costs of the inputs. The relationship between the average long-run cost curve that includes the fixed costs and the average variable cost curve will then be similar to the relationship between the average expenditure curve in the short run and the average cost curve in the short run. The difference between the magenta long-run average cost curve and the dotted green long-run average variable cost curve is only the fixed costs. So the difference between the two average curves is the average fixed cost, which diminishes as output increases, causing the two curves to converge. When output is equal to 1, then the average fixed cost is equal to the fixed cost, and so the difference between the magenta and the dotted green curves is exactly equal to the fixed cost. In the long run, you have to cover both your variable costs and your fixed costs in order to stay in business. As a result, the portion of the long-run marginal cost curve that's the firm's long-run supply curve is the portion that lies above the average cost curve that includes the fixed costs. We will therefore rarely draw the average long-run variable cost curve because it really adds no economically meaningful information. In order to know about the firm's behavior in the long run, all we have to know is the firm's long-run marginal costs, as well as the firm's long-run average cost, where that average cost has to include all its costs, including the fixed costs. Notice again that so long as we define costs appropriately, the firm's supply curve is always the marginal cost curve that lies above its average cost. In the short run, we count as average costs only the costs associated with the variable input labor, because we've assumed that capital is fixed in the short run and therefore not a real economic cost. In the short run picture, we can therefore ignore the average expenditure curve and focus only on the average cost curve that's associated with labor and the marginal cost curve. In the long run, all costs become real costs, and so we have to count not only the cost of labor and the cost of capital, which has become a variable cost in the long run, but also any fixed costs that the firm might incur and might only be able to avoid by exiting. Thus we come up with a long-run average cost curve, and we can ignore the average variable cost curve in the long run and simply focus on that cost curve that includes all the costs, as well as the marginal cost curve.